James Jimmy Wilson, an 86-year-old Korean War veteran, faces humiliation at First National Bank when manager Darren Phillips tears his military ID, accusing him of fraud. Silent tears fall as customers film and mock him. Despite Sarah Mitchell's attempts to intervene, Jimmy's pleas are ignored. Social media brands him a fake, and foreclosure looms. Sarah uncovers hints of Jimmy's classified past, but Darren dismisses her. As Jimmy contemplates a sealed letter hiding decades-old secrets, the bank doors burst open, revealing a furious four-star general. What truths will unravel, and how will they shatter those who doubted him? Love stories of vindication and hidden heroes? Subscribe to American Valor Stories on YouTube. Join our community to uncover more tales of forgotten warriors restored to honor. Hit that subscribe button, share, and support our mission to give silent heroes their voice. Be part of the journey today. On a crisp Tuesday morning, James Jimmy Wilson stepped into the First National Bank, his faded Korean War veteran cap perched proudly atop his thinning gray hair. At 86, his once robust frame now bore the weight of time, moving with a cautious shuffle that masked the persistent ache of shrapnel scars etched into his body from battles fought on frozen Korean hillsides 7 decades prior. The pain was a constant companion, yet Jimmy never spoke of it. He carried the stoic resilience of a man who had seen horrors most could scarcely imagine, images of blood-soaked snow and fallen comrades that haunted his quiet moments. His modest one-bedroom apartment, tucked in a quiet corner of town, was a sanctuary of memories. Every Sunday, with a reverence bordering on ritual, he polished his service medals, displayed in a simple glass cabinet that gleamed under the soft light of a single lamp. Those medals held stories he rarely shared, their weight far heavier than the metal they were forged from. His only son, who had followed in his military footsteps, was lost to an IED in Afghanistan in 2006, leaving Jimmy to navigate a solitary existence. The local VFW hall, where younger veterans gathered, felt like a foreign land. His war was too distant, his demeanor too reserved, and his tales of service were often met with polite nods before conversations drifted elsewhere. When pressed about his past, Jimmy would deflect with a quiet, "Just did my duty, that's all." His eyes tracing a horizon only he could see, where memories of sacrifice lingered like ghosts. Financial strain had crept into Jimmy's life like an uninvited guest. Medical bills from recent ailments had drained his modest savings, pushing him to the brink of losing the home that held his memories. After weeks of meticulous preparation, he had completed his application for the Veterans Financial Assistance Program, his last lifeline to keep the roof over his head. Each document was a testament to his service, gathered with the same care he gave to his medals. As he entered the bank, his heart carried a flicker of hope, tempered by the weariness of a man who had faced too many battles to believe in easy victories. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the bank's lobby, Darren Phillips, the 35-year-old branch manager, stood behind the counter, his designer watch glinting as he flipped through Jimmy's paperwork. His face twisted into a scowl, his lips curling with disdain. Another veteran application, he thought, his mind already primed with skepticism. Darren had seen a flood of such claims lately, and in his eyes, each one was a potential fraud, a drain on the system he prided himself on protecting. His tone dripped with contempt as he addressed Jimmy, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "We've been getting a lot of these applications lately," he said, his voice carrying an accusation that hung in the air. Jimmy stood patiently, his weathered hands clasped in front of him, his eyes steady despite the sting of Darren's words. The manager's scrutiny intensified, his fingers tapping impatiently on the counter. "These records look unusual," he declared, holding up a document from 1953. "No digital verification codes. No immediate database match for your service record." Jimmy's voice, soft but steady, broke the tension. "They are from 1953, sir. That's how they were issued back then." His explanation was met with a dismissive scoff. "Convenient," Darren muttered, loud enough for nearby customers to turn their heads. A murmur rippled through the lobby, and Jimmy felt the weight of their stares, each one a small wound to his dignity. Sarah Mitchell, a young loan officer with a kind face and a nervous demeanor, approached cautiously. "Mr. Phillips," she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper, "many Korean War records aren't fully digitized yet. Maybe we could—" Her words were cut short by Darren's sharp glare. "Not now, Sarah. We have procedures," he snapped, his tone leaving no room for debate. Sarah retreated, her eyes flickering with sympathy as she glanced at Jimmy, who stood silently, his face a mask of quiet endurance. The bank's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. Other employees exchanged knowing glances, some whispering about another fake hero within earshot of Jimmy. Over the past weeks, his visits to the bank had been marked by frustration. Misplaced documents, hours-long waits, while wealthier clients were whisked away to private offices, and snide remarks that cut deeper than he let on. On one visit, Darren had eyed Jimmy's worn service cap and remarked, "That could have been bought at any surplus store," signaling a security guard to watch him as if he were a common thief. The humiliation stung, but Jimmy bore it with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through war. Today, he had arrived with every required document, his military ID worn but legible, a tangible link to the sacrifices of his youth. He stood before Darren, hopeful yet braced for rejection, his heart pounding with the weight of what this application meant for his future. Darren held Jimmy's military ID under the lobby's bright lights, his eyes narrowing as he examined it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Mr. Wilson," he announced, his voice booming through the lobby, "this ID appears suspicious. The watermark doesn't match our verification standards." The words landed like a blow and a hush fell over the room. Customers pulled out of their phones, their cameras capturing the scene as Jimmy's hands trembled slightly, clutching the rejection letter Darren had thrust at him. "Sir, we take stolen valor very seriously here," Darren proclaimed, his voice laced with self-righteous indignation. "I did serve," Jimmy began, his voice steady but soft. "Echo Company, 1952. He was cut off by Darren's contemptuous laugh. "Anyone can memorize details from the internet," the manager sneered, tearing Jimmy's military ID in half with a theatrical flourish. The sound of the ripping plastic echoed in the silent lobby, and Jimmy froze, his weathered face betraying no sound as silent tears traced the lines of his cheeks. The pain wasn't in the torn ID, but in the erasure of his truth, the dismissal of a life spent in service. A woman nearby hissed, "Shameful fake," her words a dagger to Jimmy's heart, and the cameras kept rolling, immortalizing his humiliation. In that moment, the bank doors burst open, and a four-star general stormed in, his face a mask of unmistakable fury. His presence commanded the room, silencing the whispers and freezing the onlookers. His eyes locked onto Jimmy, and in them burned a rage that spoke of truths yet untold, secrets of classified wars and hidden sacrifices that Jimmy had carried in silence for decades. What had this quiet veteran endured that the world would never know? And how would the truth, now on the verge of revelation, shatter those who had dared to strip him of his honor? The air in the bank was thick with tension, a suffocating blend of bureaucracy and suspicion, as Jimmy, a frail figure with weathered hands and a faded cap, was ushered out by security. His steps were slow, each one heavy with the weight of rejection, his eyes clouded with a mix of shame and quiet defiance. Sarah, a young teller who had watched the scene unfold, felt a pang in her chest, her whispered words barely audible over the hum of the lobby. "This is disgusting," she murmured, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I'm so sorry." Her heart ached for the old man, whose dignity seemed to crumble with every step toward the glass's doors. Something in his posture, the way he held his shoulders, the flicker of pride in his eyes despite the humiliation, stayed with her, gnawing at her conscience long after he was gone. The next morning, Jimmy sat alone at his kitchen table, the wood scarred from years of use, surrounded by a sea of papers that told the story of his unraveling life. Foreclosure notices, medical bills, and rejection letters from the Veterans Affairs Office were strewn across the surface, each one a reminder of a system that had turned its back on him. His hands, gnarled from age and a lifetime of hardship, trembled as he sifted through the documents. 3 times he had applied for assistance, meticulously gathering every scrap of evidence he could. Discharge papers, faded photographs, a tattered letter from a commanding officer, only to be told it wasn't enough. Insufficient documentation, they said, as if his decades of service could be reduced to a missing form. He had called the VA office again, his voice steady but weary, only to hear the same apologetic tone from a representative drowning in a backlog of cases. Records from the pre-digital era are spotty, she explained, her sympathy genuine but powerless. Korean War veterans like you often slip through the cracks. The system wasn't built for you. A 6-month wait for record requests was standard, she added. But for Jimmy, time was a luxury he didn't have. His home, his health, his very sense of self were slipping away, and the world seemed content to let it happen. Across town, in a sleek conference room bathed in fluorescent light, Darren, a bank manager with a sharp suit and sharper tongue, leaned back in his chair, basking in the approval of his colleagues. Another Valor thief shut down, he boasted, his voice dripping with self-righteous satisfaction. These old guys think they can waltz in with some dusty papers and cash in on benefits they never earned. His words were met with knees and chuckles, the room united in their skepticism of men like Jimmy. A leaked memo from the bank's CEO, circulated among the staff, had set the tone. Prioritize digital verification, tighten the screws on fraud, and treat physical documents with suspicion. The directive was clear. Protect the institution at all costs, even if it meant turning away those who might deserve help. Darren wore his role as gatekeeper like a badge of honor, oblivious to the human cost of his vigilance. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her gut. During her lunch break, she found herself wandering into the county library's military archives section, driven by an instinct she couldn't quite name. Jimmy's demeanor, the quiet strength beneath his weathered exterior, the way his eyes held a story he didn't tell, had struck a chord. She sat at a microfilm reader, the machine's hum filling the silence as she scrolled through grainy records. After hours of searching, she stumbled upon a partially redacted file bearing Jimmy's name. The details were scarce, heavily censored under the vague title, Operation Forgotten. One line stood out, unmarred by the black ink, a presidential unit citation awarded to an unspecified special operations group. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't the record of a fraud. This was something real, something hidden. That evening, Sarah visited her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran whose own stories of war were told in quiet moments over coffee. She described Jimmy's unit insignia, a patch she'd noticed on his jacket, and her grandfather's eyes darkened with recognition. "Those boys weren't regular infantry," he said, his voice low as if the walls might overhear. "Mountain warfare, secretive stuff. They went places no one talks about, did things that still haven't been declassified." His words carried the weight of someone who knew the cost of silence, the way history could bury its heroes. Sarah's mind raced. She dug deeper, finding an old newspaper clipping tucked away in the library's archives. It mentioned 12 missing soldiers rescued by an unidentified hero, the dates aligning perfectly with Jimmy's service. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. Meanwhile, the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. On a local Facebook group, Jimmy's name was dragged through the mud, labeled a suspicious character, chasing benefits he hadn't earned. Comments piled up, each one more callous than the last. Why is he so cagey about his service? Real veterans don't hide. Probably just another old guy looking for a handout. The local VFW Post, dominated by younger veterans from Vietnam and the Gulf War, dismissed Korean War stories as relics of a bygone era, their skepticism fueled by a culture that revered only the wars they could relate to. Community members, unaware of Jimmy's struggles, suggested he get a bois, ignoring the cane he leaned on and the frailty of his 80-year-old frame. A newspaper editorial fanned the flames, warning of an epidemic of stolen valor, draining resources from real heroes. Its author too lazy to investigate the truth. At the bank, the culture was no kinder. Behind closed doors, employees mocked elderly loan applicants as the entitled generation, their applications flagged as high risk before they even reached a desk. Some customers had applauded Darren's hardline stance, praising him for protecting resources for real veterans. The irony was bitter. Jimmy, who had risked everything, was now a pariah in the eyes of those who claimed to honor service. Even his church group, a place he'd once found solace, turned him away when he asked for help with his foreclosure. "We can't be sure about your military status," they said, their words laced with doubt. At the grocery store, he overheard whispers. another old man pretending in military garb. A local radio host's rant about welfare seekers wearing veteran caps for sympathy only deepened the public's distrust, painting men like Jimmy as parasites. Sarah pressed on, her determination growing with every clue. In the library's restricted section, she found Jimmy's name on a memorial list not meant for public eyes, a quiet tribute to those who served in shadows. References to a general, unnamed but revered, hinted at missions too sensitive to be fully documented. Each discovery fueled her resolve, but it also deepened her frustration with the world that seemed determined to erase Jimmy's legacy. For Sarah, this was no longer just about one man. It was about a system that had failed its own, a society too quick to judge and too slow to listen. For Jimmy, it was another day of fighting a war he thought he'd left behind, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his sacrifices might never be seen. The weight of decades pressed heavily on Jimmy Wilson's shoulders as he sat alone in his modest room that evening, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His gnarled fingers traced the edges of a sealed letter tucked inside his bedside drawer, the words, "Open only upon my death," scrawled in his own steady hand from years past. The paper felt like a relic, heavy with secrets he'd carried for 70 years, an anchor tying him to a life of silent sacrifice. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, lingered on the letter as his mind drifted to frozen mountains, to nights spent in enemy territory where survival was a fleeting hope. He'd honored his oath of silence about those covert operations, missions that, according to official records, never existed. Now, that same secrecy threatened to unravel the fragile life he'd built. The bureaucracy of modern databases, cold and unyielding, couldn't account for the kind of service he'd given, and the looming threat of homelessness gnawed at him. He'd faced death in the icy trenches of Korea, but this, a rejection by the very society he'd served, cut deeper than any bullet. Earlier that day, Sarah, a young bank clerk with a heart too soft for the sterile world of finance, had stumbled upon something that stirred her curiosity and compassion. While Jimmy fumbled through his worn wallet for identification, a fleeting glimpse of a handwritten note caught her eye. "Mission still silent, but brotherhood endures." The words, penned in fading ink, seemed to carry a story untold, a quiet testament to a life of unspoken valor. Her gut told her there was more to Jimmy than the frail elderly man the world saw. Driven by an instinct she couldn't ignore, she approached her manager, Darren Phillips, with her findings. Her voice trembled with urgency as she pleaded for him to reconsider Jimmy's case. "What if we're wrong about him, sir? What if he really did serve?" she asked, her eyes searching Darren's for a flicker of empathy. But Darren, cloaked in the arrogance of protocol, dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Even if he served, which I highly doubt, his papers don't meet modern verification standards," he said, his tone clipped and final. "We can't bend the rules for sentimentality, Sarah. The burden of proof lies with him." His words landed like a gavel, ending the conversation. As a final blow, he added, "I've already reported him to the Veteran Fraud Hotline." Sarah's heart sank, her faith in the system shaken by the callousness of his decision. Jimmy, unaware of the storm brewing around his name, returned to his solitude that night, the sealed letter still unopened. The weight of his unspoken truth pressed against his chest, a burden he had carried alone since the war. He thought of his brothers in arms, men whose faces were etched in his memory, men who had trusted him to lead them through the darkest of nights. He'd survived those freezing operations, not for glory or recognition, but for them, for the brotherhood that endured even now, long after the world had moved on. Yet here he was, on the brink of losing his small home, defeated not by enemy fire, but by a society that demanded proof he could never provide. The irony was bitter, and as he sat in the quiet, he wondered if his silence had been worth it. The following Monday, Jimmy made one final pilgrimage to First National Bank, his steps slow but deliberate. In his hand, he clutched a worn military photograph, its edges frayed from years of quiet reverence. The image was his last tether to the truth, a faded snapshot of his unit standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim but resolute. It was all he had left to offer, his final stand before accepting defeat. As he crossed the threshold of the bank, the lobby fell into a hushed stillness, the air thick with judgment. Whispers of stolen valor had spread like wildfire on social media, turning Jimmy into a pariah in the eyes of strangers. Customers cast sidelong glances, their phones discreetly raised to capture the spectacle. One woman, her face twisted in disdain, muttered, "Shameful fake," just loud enough for the words to sting. Behind the counter, bank employees shuffled paperwork, already processing the foreclosure that would strip Jimmy of his home. Darren emerged from his office with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His tailored suit and polished demeanor stood in stark contrast to Jimmy's weathered frame. "Mr. Wilson," he announced, his voice ringing out for all to hear, "we've confirmed with authorities that your application is questionable at best." A security guard inched closer, his presence a silent threat despite Jimmy's frailty. Darren straightened his expensive tie, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "We've contacted the veteran fraud hotline about your case, Mr. Wilson. I suggest you leave before things become more embarrassing." The words were a public execution designed to humiliate. Sarah, standing nearby, clutched a stack of documents, her face pale with frustration. "Sir, I really think we need to reconsider," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Darren's eyes narrowed, cutting her off. "We've seen enough, Sarah. Security will escort Mr. Wilson out." Jimmy stood motionless, his dignity a quiet fortress against the onslaught. His hands, trembling slightly, held the photograph with care, as if it were a sacred artifact. His gaze wasn't one of anger, but of profound sorrow, a reflection of a man who'd given everything and received nothing in return. "This is my unit," he said softly, his voice barely audible in the hostile room. Few bothered to listen, their minds already made up. The security guard reached for his arm, ready to usher him out like a common criminal. But then the bank's double doors burst open with a force that rattled the glass, triggering the security alarm in a shrill wail. Every head turned, every breath caught. In the doorway stood a figure who seemed to command the very air around him. General Robert Hayes, now in his 90s, but still a towering presence in his full military dress uniform. 4 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder, a testament to a lifetime of service. Flanked by 2 uniformed aides, he strode into the lobby with the authority of a battlefield commander. "Attention," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The bank fell silent, the crowd instinctively straightening under the weight of his command. Darren, suddenly small in the general's shadow, stepped forward, his confidence faltering. "I'm the manager, sir, Darren Phillips," he said, his voice unsteady. Hayes's eyes, sharp and unyielding, fixed on him. "You've been harassing one of my men," he said, his tone like steel. He produced a folder stamped "Top Secret" in faded red letters, its presence alone shifting the room's atmosphere. "James Wilson served under my direct command during the most classified operation of the Korean War." Darren's face drained of color, his earlier bravado crumbling. The general's voice grew quieter but no less commanding. "Sergeant Wilson led a mission behind enemy lines to rescue 12 captured American soldiers." The words hung in the air, a revelation that reshaped every assumption in the room. Jimmy, still clutching his photograph, stood a little taller, his eyes meeting Hayes's with a silent acknowledgement of their shared past. The weight of a nation's secrets had kept the truth buried for decades, locked away under the guise of national security until just days ago. General Hayes, his face etched with the gravity of years spent safeguarding those secrets, opened a worn folder on the table before him. Inside were documents stamped with presidential seals, their edges yellowed but their authority undiminished. Each page told a story of sacrifice so profound it had been erased from public memory for 70 years. Hayes's hands trembled slightly, not from age but from the reverence he felt as he revealed the truth about Jimmy Wilson, a man whose quiet heroism had been questioned just moments earlier in this very bank. Jimmy Wilson had been honored with the Silver Star in a clandestine Pentagon ceremony decades ago, an event so shrouded in secrecy that even the Pentagon's own records barely acknowledged it. His unit had undertaken missions so sensitive that their existence was denied by the government, their names scrubbed from official histories. Hayes held up a faded photograph, its black and white tones capturing a young Jimmy, his face resolute yet weary, as President Eisenhower pinned a medal to his chest. The general's voice wavered as he spoke, the memory of Jimmy's courage flooding back. "This man," Hayes said, his words heavy with emotion, carried 2 wounded soldiers 20 meters through enemy fire, his back bent under their weight. his heart pounding with the fear of failing them. He saved their lives while bullets tore through the air around him. The room fell silent, the air thick with awe and shame. Jimmy's records had been sealed by a presidential order, hidden from databases and public scrutiny, which explained why they had never appeared in the bank's system. Darren, the bank manager who had moments ago challenged Jimmy's claims of service, stood frozen, his face drained of color. His career, built on protocols and automated verifications, now seemed trivial in the face of this revelation. General Hayes approached Jimmy, his steps deliberate, and placed a hand on the elderly man's shoulder with a respect so profound it seemed to carry the weight of the entire nation. "Last week," Hayes continued, his voice steady but piercing, "I was at the Pentagon, signing a recommendation for Jimmy to receive the Medal of Honor, the highest military recognition this country can bestow. While you were doubting his honor, I was ensuring his sacrifice would finally be acknowledged." Each word landed like a blow, not just to Darren, but to everyone in the room who had witnessed the confrontation. Customers who had been filming the heated exchange on their phones now lowered their devices, their fingers hesitating before deleting the videos in a quiet act of remorse. The bank's CEO, summoned by a call from the general's office, arrived breathless and apologetic. His polished suit and practiced smile couldn't mask the unease in his eyes as he offered profuse apologies to Jimmy. Hayes, standing tall despite his years, explained why Jimmy had never spoken of his heroism. "His comrade's mission remains classified to this day," he said. "Jimmy took an oath of silence and kept it for 70 years, not for himself, but for the men he served with and the country he loves." The general's words painted a portrait of a man whose loyalty ran deeper than most could fathom, a man who had carried the burden of silence as faithfully as he had carried his wounded comrades. Sarah, a young bank teller who had quietly believed in Jimmy when others hadn't, stepped forward. Her hand shook slightly as she handed him a thin file, its pages documenting the countless times his loan applications had been rejected despite his valid claims. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, Jimmy's weathered face softened. His gratitude was unspoken, but unmistakable, a quiet acknowledgement of her faith in him when the world had turned its back. For Sarah, it was a moment of vindication, a reminder that kindness and trust could cut through the cold machinery of bureaucracy. Darren, his voice barely above a whisper, attempted an apology. "We had no way of knowing," he stammered, his words hollow in the face of the truth. General Hayes cut him off, his tone sharp but not cruel. "You had his word as a soldier," he said. "That should have been enough." The rebuke hung in the air, a challenge to everyone present to reconsider what trust and honor truly meant. Jimmy, who had remained silent through the ordeal, finally spoke. His voice was soft, weathered by time, but it carried a clarity that silenced the room. "I didn't come here for recognition," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor as if revisiting a memory only he could see. "I just needed to keep my home." The simplicity of his words, the humility behind them, struck everyone in the room. Here was a man who had faced death, who had carried the weight of a nation's secrets, asking only for the chance to live out his days in peace. General Hayes rested his hand on Jimmy's shoulder again, his grip firm but gentle. "No more, old friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The country remembers now." It was a promise not just to Jimmy, but to every forgotten hero whose sacrifices had been buried under layers of secrecy and indifference. The aftermath of that day rippled far beyond the bank's walls. First National Bank approved Jimmy's loan with preferred terms, waiving all fees in a gesture of amends. The CEO, shaken by the incident, issued company-wide policy changes, establishing the Wilson Protocol to ensure veterans of pre-digital conflicts received the respect and consideration their service demanded. Jimmy's story sparked a congressional investigation, uncovering thousands of elderly veterans whose records, like his, existed only in partially classified paper files. These men and women, heroes of forgotten wars, had been denied benefits and recognition simply because their service predated modern databases. Darren was reassigned to compliance training, his new role focused on veteran verification processes. The demotion was humbling, but he approached it with a newfound respect for the men and women whose stories he had once dismissed. Sarah, meanwhile, was promoted to Veteran Service Specialist at the bank's headquarters. Her compassion and diligence earned her a role developing training programs to recognize legitimate but unconventional service records, ensuring no one else would face the humiliation Jimmy had endured. The National Banking Association responded by creating legacy veteran verification standards, offering alternative pathways for elderly veterans to prove their service history. Jimmy's modest home, once on the brink of foreclosure, was saved. Local veterans, inspired by his story, rallied to repair its leaking roof and broken furnace, their hammers and laughter filling the air as they worked to honor one of their own. First National Bank established the Wilson Fund, a program to provide bridge financing for veterans with incomplete documentation while their records were located. General Hayes, moved by Jimmy's story, launched a national campaign to identify other forgotten heroes whose classified operations had left them without recognition. The Pentagon, under pressure, expedited the declassification of certain Korean War special operations, allowing long-buried truths to see the light. The campaign's rallying cry, "A nation's character is measured by how it treats those who sacrifice during its darkest hours," resonated across the country. Local schools introduced living history programs, inviting Korean War veterans to share their experiences with students eager to learn. Media coverage shifted, moving away from sensationalized fears of stolen valor to heartfelt stories of recognition and redemption. Jimmy Wilson, a man who had never sought the spotlight, became a symbol of quiet heroism. His story reminded a nation that honor isn't found in databases or public records, but in the courage to do what's right, even when no one is watching. 70 years had slipped by since the Korean War, a conflict that had faded into the shadows of history, its heroes often overlooked. In a small town, the community stirred with a newfound resolve to right a decades-old wrong. They organized vibrant welcome home parades for the aging veterans, long overdue tributes that pulsed with gratitude and sorrow. The streets overflowed with the cheering neighbors, their signs and flags waving under a crisp autumn sky, as the veterans, stooped but proud, marched or were wheeled along the route. For men like Jimmy, who had carried the weight of their service in silence, the sight of familiar faces now beaming with respect stirred a quiet ache in their hearts. They had fought in a war the world seemed eager to forget, their sacrifices buried under layers of time and indifference. Yet as the crowd's applause washed over them, a flicker of healing sparked within, bittersweet but undeniable. At the local bank, a shift was underway. New training programs had been introduced, emphasizing not just procedure, but principle. Employees were taught to approach their work with a reverence for honor, especially when verifying the identities of veterans seeking benefits. The training manuals now included a section titled Preserving Dignity, urging staff to look beyond paperwork and see the person, their struggles, their pride, their unspoken stories. For many of the tellers, this was a revelation. They began to understand that a worn veteran's ID or a faded discharge paper wasn't just documentation. It was a fragment of a life shaped by courage. The bank's culture softened, and employees like Sarah, a young teller with a sharp mind and a kind heart, felt a growing sense of purpose. She had once viewed her job as routine, but now she saw it as a chance to honor those who had given so much. Each interaction with a veteran became a quiet act of respect, a way to mend the cracks left by years of oversight. The Veterans of Foreign Wars headquarters took bold steps to acknowledge those who served before Vietnam, recognizing the unique burdens they carried. Pre-Vietnam veterans, particularly those from the Korean War, had often faced skepticism when proving their service. Records were incomplete, memories faded, and many had no one to vouch for their sacrifices. The VFW established a special recognition program, a formal tribute to these warriors whose contributions had been obscured by time and bureaucracy. For the recipients, it was more than a certificate or a pin. It was validation, a long-awaited affirmation that their struggles mattered. Some wept openly as they received their honors, their hands trembling, not from age, but from the weight of finally being seen. Military historians, too, were doing their part. They delved into archives, unearthing details of classified operations that had remained hidden for decades. These missions, often conducted in the harshest conditions, had been critical to the nation's security. Yet the men who carried them out were rarely named. As the historians published their findings, they gave credit to those unsung participants, restoring their place in the narrative of valor. For the veterans who read these accounts, it was as if a veil had been lifted. They saw their younger selves, brave, determined, and fiercely loyal, finally acknowledged in the pages of history. The recognition stirred a complex mix of pride and pain, for many had lost comrades whose names would never appear in those books. 6 months later, Jimmy stood in the grandeur of the White House, his chest heavy with the weight of the Medal of Honor being pinned to his suit. The ceremony was a blur of formal words and solemn handshakes, but for Jimmy, it was the culmination of a lifetime of quiet endurance. He thought of the frozen mountains of Korea, the comrades who never made it home, and the decades he'd spent carrying their memory in silence. As the president spoke of his heroism, Jimmy's mind wandered to those who weren't there to hear it. His brothers in arms, whose sacrifices were the true foundation of the honor he now received. His eyes glistened, but he stood tall, a man who had never sought the spotlight but now carried it for those who could not. Back in his hometown, the streets were lined with faces that had once doubted its image, former bank customers who had whispered skeptically about his claims of service, now stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions softened with understanding. They had seen the news, heard the stories, and realized that quiet heroism often wore no badge until someone bothered to look closer. Jimmy's return was a moment of collective redemption for the town. They cheered not just for him, but for the chance to make things right, to honor a man they had misjudged. For Jimmy, the applause was less about pride than about connection, a reminder that his story, once buried, now resonated with those around him. At the local high school, Jimmy stepped into a gymnasium filled with students, their usual chatter replaced by an eerie, attentive silence. For the first time, he shared his story publicly, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I kept silent for my brothers who didn't come home," he told them, his eyes scanning the young faces before him. "Their mission still protects you today." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The students, many of whom had never heard of the Korean War in detail, felt a shift in their understanding of history. It was no longer just dates and battles. It was the story of men like Jimmy, whose sacrifices were woven into the fabric of their lives. For Jimmy, speaking was both a release and a burden. He was breaking a vow of silence he'd kept for decades, yet he felt the weight of representing those who could never speak for themselves. Among the crowd at the school was the former bank manager, the man who had once questioned Jimmy's claims with a cold professionalism. He approached Jimmy after the talk, his face etched with regret. Jimmy extended his hand, his grip firm but forgiving. "We all make mistakes," he said simply, his voice free of bitterness. For the manager, those words were a gift, a chance to let go of the guilt that had gnawed at him since he'd learned the truth about Jimmy's service. The handshake was a quiet reconciliation, a moment where two men, flawed and human, found common ground in the pursuit of redemption. Sarah, the young teller who had processed Jimmy's paperwork with newfound care, felt a fire kindled within her. Inspired by his story, she established a scholarship for students researching forgotten military history. She wanted to ensure that the next generation would uncover and honor the stories that time had buried. The act of creating the scholarship filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was seeking. It was her way of contributing to the legacy of men like Jimmy, ensuring their sacrifices would not fade again. In the bank's lobby, a new display took shape. Photographs of local veterans now adorned the walls, their faces a testament to the town's pride and penance. Among them was a young Jimmy, captured in his mountain warfare uniform, his eyes bright with the determination of youth. Customers passing through the lobby paused to look, some lingering longer than others, struck by the realization that heroes had walked among them all along. The display was more than decoration. It was a daily reminder of the debt owed to those who had served in silence. In the final scene, Jimmy sat at the VA hospital, surrounded by other Korean War veterans, men whose names were known to few but whose stories echoed his own. They shared quiet conversations, their voices, low but warm, filled with the camaraderie of those who had faced the same trials. Jimmy looked into their weathered faces and saw not just survivors, but brothers. He visited often, bringing stories, laughter, and sometimes just silence, a shared understanding that needed no words. To a group of students who had come to volunteer, he offered a final reflection. The greatest honor isn't the medals. It's serving alongside heroes whose names you'll never know. His words carried the weight of a lifetime, a truth forged in the crucible of war and tempered by years of quiet resilience. Heroes Jimmy knew walked among them every day. Josh, dating, unrecognized, unhonored, but no less extraordinary. Their stories once forgotten were now finding a voice, and in that voice a measure of justice was restored.